welcome to today's presentation, Legal Rights of Immigrant Child Commercial Sex Trafficking Survivors, Public Benefits, Housing, and Victim Services. I'm Lauren Beal, Senior Program Manager at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. NCJFCJ is a national nonprofit judicial membership organization, and we provide training and technical assistance to courts around the country on topics related to juvenile and family courts, including best practices in the treatment of survivors of child sex trafficking and the resources available to children who survive sex trafficking. If you'd like more information about NCJ, FCJ, or would like to know more about membership, we will include a link to our website in the chat. And just a disclaimer, this funding was provided by the Novo Foundation, but the points of view that are expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not represent the official position or policies of the Novo Foundation. Today, I'm very excited to say we are joined by Judge Ramona Gonzales and Professor Leslie Orloff, and I will allow them to introduce themselves.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome. My name is Ramona Gonzales. I'm a judge in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I do a general jurisdiction calendar, which means I do everything from the murder trial to the traffic tickets. I am a former president of NCJFCJ, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and we're delighted that you've chosen to spend this time with us.
I'm Leslie Orloff, and I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. I'm a family lawyer and have done work with immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking for about 4 decades now, and was involved in drafting the immigration provisions and the public benefits access provisions of the Violence Against Women Act, that many of which we're going to be talking about today. So for me, I get really excited to be here because it's really the work that you all are doing in the field and making sure that judges and court staff and people that work in and around the court system and with children and adult victims of trafficking have the knowledge and the tools they need so that they can help the survivors gain access to everything they're eligible to receive when they're working with them.
So I kind of threw Leslie a curveball there, but I am often asked, Judge, why do you care? Why do you care, Judge? Your job is to call the balls and strikes. That's your job. Why do you get involved in all this extra stuff? And, you know, we have an obligation as judges. That obligation is to do justice. And it is very difficult for folks to do and accomplish what we need them to do, those things that we ask them to do as judges, if they can't keep body and soul together. Our communities struggle to provide housing, healthcare, food to the individuals who just happen to pass through or be part of our communities. And having those resources be able to tap into some of these federal programs, some of these public benefits does a lot to assist our communities, our counties, our cities, our states in meeting the needs of those who we have to serve. So we're glad that you're going to spend this 90 minutes with us. We're not going to make you experts, right, Leslie? We're not making you experts on public benefits. We're not going to make you advocates to go out there and fill out paperwork or anything like that. But what I think is really important for judges to have is sort of an understanding of what benefits are out there and how the individuals that you are trying to reach may qualify for those benefits. Because encouraging those benefits, the application of those benefits, and encouraging communities, stakeholders to understand the importance of bringing those to your community, that I think will go a long way to allowing you to provide the services and the access to justice that we judges are required to allow to our constituencies. So I think that I've answered your question before you asked it, Leslie.
Well, that's true. And I will just add that when you look at the social science research we've done with immigrant victims, what we learn is that when they have that access to these various different kinds of benefits and access to work authorization and protection from deportation, those kinds of things combined create a stability that lead to, you know, a 114% increase in the willingness to call police for help, or the willingness to work with prosecutors, the willingness to come to court. Immigrant survivors who get the kinds of support that these programs offer and that the immigration relief offers, you know, 22% of them are reaching out to other survivors in the community and bringing them to court and telling them about the help that they got and helping others access justice. So this is a way that we can serve as a catalyst to help the crime victim that you might see today, who will then potentially reach out and encourage somebody else to come forward. And that makes all of our communities safer.
So it is about community safety. And so by the end of this workshop, you will be better able to know which publicly funded benefits and services are open to which child trafficking victims and their caretakers without regard to their immigration status. You'll be able to use NEWAP's public benefits map, which is wonderful. Wonderful. It's a state-of-the-art charts to look up state and federally funded benefits or services for which child trafficking victims and other immigrant crime victims qualify. So you can use them and you can encourage your stakeholders to use them. And you'll be better able to issue orders that reflect the programs and services immigrant child victims of commercial sex trafficking and their non-abusive parents are eligible to receive. So let's take a poll. Let us know who's in the room in the webinar with us today. Can you check your box and tell me which one of these describes you best? Are you a judge? Are you a court staff, law clerk, or victim advocate? Are you child welfare, children's advocacy attorney? And I saw that we had a psychologist in the mix today too. So we'll have at least one other. Okay. How's our poll going?
72% so far.
Oh, so we've got a smattering of all sorts of folks. So that hopefully then there will be some time to have some input and some conversation. And so hopefully we should be able to make that a productive 90 minutes for you.
So let's take our second poll. And that is, so this is a true or false question. A judge can require parties to apply for public benefits a sex trafficked child is eligible to receive. Is that true or false?
I love how we call these polls, but they're actually true or false tests, but they're, they're a conversation piece, right, Leslie?
Right, exactly. So this one is very interesting. Can you share the results, Malika? And that basically we got a 50-50 split.
Oh, okay.
So Judge Gonzales, what's the answer?
Well, I certainly can require someone to apply for benefits if I believe that it's necessary for a trafficked child to get those benefits.
Exactly. And what's important here is we're talking about sex trafficking, but when we're talking about children and trafficking victims generally, it's important to understand that everything we talk about today about sex trafficking, trafficked children also applies to labor trafficked children, because there's a very, sometimes the labor trafficking might be easier to prove from an immigration perspective than the sex trafficking. And so it's important to not put all the eggs in one basket, I guess you could say, because the relief that is available and the help the child needs can come equally through either avenue.
And I think, Leslie, it's also important to understand that the order is not that they get the benefits, but that they apply for the benefits, because judges aren't going to make the determination of whether somebody's eligible. But if you don't ask, you don't get. And so we can certainly require that people ask.
Right. Exactly. And one of the reasons that's so important, Judge Gonzales, is that when we look at the field, one of the big problems with benefits access for immigrant children and immigrants generally, particularly crime victims, is that people don't apply for much of what they're eligible for. And the judge may be the only person in the room that, because they've attended this webinar, knows what this victim is eligible for, so they can serve as a catalyst to get that application process going.
Good, so then let's ask him another question. What do you think?
Sounds good.
So participants, in what kind of court cases could a judge issue an order on a child's behalf that there be an application for benefits?
And this one is check all that apply. Oh, we got about 76% of you responding. Okay. So we're seeing 100% of you are saying guardianship, 73% custody, 100% child abuse and neglect, 64% divorce, and 91% delinquency.
And I think the answer, depending on the circumstances, can be any of these. And in fact, can be a whole multitude of other cases. Because whenever you have a situation in which one of these potential recipients are either a victim of crime or an assisting in a crime or just part of the child welfare situation or part of any kind of court action where you think this might be of benefit to the child, and in some situations the caregivers, I think it's important for judges to understand that they have that power and can make such an order. So should we, since we only have 16 folks, can we just ask them if to unmute themselves if they've got any kind of experience with any of these cases?
Yeah,
Just to
I
see
think
what,
that's a good idea.
yeah, just to get a little flavor of who we've got in the room. If no one wants to turn on their sound, you can just let us know in the chat. Does anyone have any experience with any of these kinds of cases?
Or you could raise your hand.
Oh, raise your hand is good too. I forget all of these wonderful things we can do with Zoom. And by the way, I call Leslie because I've known Leslie for almost 25 years. And I still haven't heard her call me Ramona. So she will call me Judge Gonzales and I will call her Leslie, but know that we respect each other in every way possible. And someday I'll get Leslie to call me Ramona, but you know.
Not in public.
Not in public. So it looks like, oh, from Dan to everyone, no. Okay, so no,
So we'll be talking about that, and hopefully you will feel more comfortable at the end of this webinar. And that's probably why you're here, is to learn about it. So it's not at all unusual. So that's not a problem. So Judge, go ahead.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Judge Gonzales, can you share kind of an innovative example of how you might have used this in a case or might have helped you in one of your cases?
My favorite example of why this is can sort of completely evade you or miss you is Judge Doug Johnson, who's a former president of NCJ/FCJ and a good friend and a retired judge from Omaha. And I had a conversation with him at one point, and I said, Doug, do you have an immigrant population in Omaha? He said, yes, I do. And I said, well, how do you deal with some of these issues? And he said, I have the power to appoint counsel, and I have appointed all sorts of counsel. And sometimes the most important counsel that I can appoint is an immigration counsel to make sure that the trafficked child or the SJIS child that I have in front of me gets all of the benefits that they're entitled to. And he said it with such certainty, and he said it with such honesty from middle America. And I thought, if Doug can do it, then a lot more people can do it, because it is important to get our individuals, our children, the help that they need. But many of us don't even think of it. And in fact, I had never thought of appointing specifically an immigration lawyer for a child.
And it's really interesting, Judge Gonzales. One of the other points about this that you should know is there was a period of time, or it's still technically true, but not with regard to crime victims, that legal services agencies would turn away people based on immigration status. But you should all know, and we'll be talking about this in a few minutes, but I'm thinking about it with your story, that legal services agencies can represent, as a matter of law, since 2000, actually since 1997, but since 2005, we wrote it into VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, that any victim of domestic human trafficking, child or adult, without regard to age, any victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, or any of the U visa criminal activities, which is a much broader list. It covers all kinds of sex crimes and covers felonious assault and attempted murder and kidnapping and all kinds of things. Any legal services agency, as a matter of law and regulation, should not ever be turning away any victim based on immigration status. So it's important to know in your community that that is a resource too, so that you could appoint immigration counsel, and then you could refer the child or their family to legal services that can help them with the benefits application process. So,
well, you've asked me some questions, Leslie. Why don't I ask you one? So tell me, what benefits and services do non-citizens qualify without regard to immigration status? Because some of the folks that have come in front of us, that's who they are.
Right. And that I always like starting here. That's a great question. I'm going to give you some details about it. Is that what's good about this is the crime victims that we identify who do qualify for immigration status, when we identify them in the beginning, they're often undocumented. And so without regard to immigration status means that anybody can get it. Somebody who's undocumented, somebody who's on a student visa, it doesn't matter that that immigration status isn't an issue. And there's a broad array of programs and services open to all immigrants without regard to immigration status. We're going to send you a link following the webinar with a web page of materials where you can see all these different programs. And I know it's hard to read on the screen, but I'm going to go over in a little bit more detail. But we have this brochure for you that is a quick reference guide that you can use. So there are services that are open to everyone. These are publicly available services. So this is why, as a matter of law, the reason police and the courts and fire and ambulance and sanitation are open to people without regard to immigration status is those are government-funded services. And the only things that have immigration restrictions are essentially cash payment to an individual, a household, or a family member. So those programs are open. As I said, legal services programs are open, and here are the different kinds of crime victimization that somebody could have suffered and be eligible. The matters have to be something related to abuse in legal services, but what's interesting here is it doesn't mean you could have somebody who's afraid to file an immigration case, but willing to file a family protection order or seek benefits, and so that their children may qualify for. So they don't have to file an immigration case, but they can. It needs to be something that helps them overcome the impact of abuse. And the legal services definition of what's connected to abuse is one of the best in law. It's really good. It deals with everything from preventing future abuse to overcoming the impact of the abuse on the victim, on the child. So it's a very good definition.
So Leslie, can I just
Sure.
say something about that? Because for judges, I think this is really crucial. We really have limited amounts of money out there in our communities for lawyers to represent folks. And sometimes legal services folks have criteria and they balk at doing this work. And I think it's important for us to take a sort of a leadership a leadership role in making sure that the legal services folks in our communities understand that all of these individuals are entitled to this representation. Because I've had the experience where some folks are turned away, and when I went back to ask, well, what do you mean you turned them away? Well, we don't do that. And I'm like, oh, yes, you do. Look at your whole reason for being. And so I just want to empower folks who are on the call here, not to shy away from questioning legal services who shy away from representing these eligible victims.
And if you run into a case where they're turning people away and they're saying no, you can call us at NewApp. We do direct technical assistance to judges, for court staff, for police, for prosecutors, for victim advocates and attorneys. And part of legal services is part of our the menu of things that we address in our technical assistance. So both documented and undocumented survivors qualify, they're entitled to language access in every state but Alabama. They are eligible for VOCA-funded crime victim assistance. We won't get into the details of Alabama at this point. They're eligible for emergency shelter everywhere, transitional housing programs everywhere. They can obtain, and they can go in as somebody who's undocumented and file for public benefits that their citizen children are eligible for. So as we talk today, we're talking about sex trafficked children or labor trafficked children. Some of those children will be citizens where the supportive parent or caregiver or guardian or auntie is an undocumented person who's helping them. And you should know that an adult who's caring for that child can go in and get the benefits for the child who's a citizen or who's eligible because they're a trafficking victim or because the child has lawful permanent residency, without dealing with any questions. And I'll go into more detail about this, about the status of the person applying, unless they're also applying for funding for themselves. So they're not supposed to be asking any questions. They can receive emergency medical care, healthcare from community and migrant health clinics. So this is a nifty tool. You'll have these slides and it's in that brochure I showed you in the beginning. So migrant and community health clinics are open to everyone without regard to immigration status. You can go to these two websites, enter in the victim's zip code for wherever they're living, and it will tell you where you can go and get subsidized healthcare for free. In addition, we have charts and the materials that we're providing you that show, that provide information about VOCA-funded post-assault health care, prenatal care, child health care by state, and forensic exams by state, and how they get paid back in sexual assault cases. Immunization, testing, and treatment of communicable diseases is also open to everybody without regard to immigration status, and emergency Medicaid. The qualified health clinics cover a lot, the federally qualified health clinics cover a lot of different kinds of care. So if you have a child who needs, primary care, everything from primary care to SDT testing to post-assault health care to mental health care, pharmaceutical services, they really are a broad range of services. In addition to the qualified, the community health clinics and migrant health clinics, there are also communities where you can go on the HHS website to see whether one of the hospitals in your community has received Hill Burton funding in their construction, which means they're required to provide care free of charge to indigent people. So that's another source of healthcare that's available without regard to immigration status. Now, what does emergency Medicaid cover? It covers it covers anything that would place a patient's health in serious jeopardy, where there's serious impairment to a bodily function or the likelihood of a dysfunction of a bodily part or organ. It covers all COVID testing and treatment. And one of the questions that I like to ask is, just to see, maybe you could put it in the chat, or maybe Judge Gonzales, you could guess, or someone else. Under what circumstances do you think immigrant crime victims are most likely to use emergency Medicaid. And we're thinking about both sex trafficked children. Well, let's take sex trafficked children. There's two instances where they're most likely to use emergency Medicaid. What do you think they are? Anybody have a guess? Anybody there? Typing, speaking? Either's possible.
I'm gotta give them time to type. So Leslie, are you talking about situations or are you talking about particular injuries? What are we talking about?
Kind of both. So the two big ones, I'll just share it with you, are okay.
Prenatal care.
Well, prenatal. So that's exactly the whole. So not so emergency Medicare. You're close, Judge. Emergency Medicaid covers childbirth because childbirth can impair a bodily function, organ, or part.
Right.
But prenatal care varies by state. And I'll show you in a few minutes how to look up how to get prenatal care for a child sex trafficking victim in your community, because it varies by state and it varies by immigration status. So we'll talk about that. But so the first one is childbirth. The second one is something you alluded to, Judge Gonzales, which is it's injuries related to the trafficking or to the physical assault. So broken arm, or the rape kit, or things like that are immediately followed where there's an urgent injury that fits this definition.
So many of our states expanded Medicaid in the last 6 years, and many others didn't. So there are many states in which poor folks are eligible for Medicaid, regardless of their status, and others where they're not. So how does that work into this particular equation?
So that's where, for people who are uninsured. So interestingly, we'll be talking about this as we go forward a little bit, but I kind of like doing it as part of a conversation as opposed to the slides anyway. So what happens is, believe it or not, if you're an immigrant, you can't even purchase healthcare on the exchange until you're considered what's called lawfully present. So a special immigrant juvenile status child, as soon as they file their immigration application, is lawfully present for healthcare purposes in terms of purchasing healthcare. But free healthcare, subsidized healthcare, is going to depend on the state, or it's available through HHS funded public health systems, or it follows within the emergency Medicaid definition. And that's the way, or there may be other community-based programs that are available, but those are the bulk of how it's available for free without regard to immigration status.
So we've got another teaser for them to stick around with us to find out where they can figure it out later, right?
Exactly. So the other thing is that other kinds of federally funded programs available to everyone are secondary and elementary and secondary education, school lunch programs and breakfast programs, WIC programs, and we already talked about the other two. We have these state-by-state charts that you can look up. Prenatal care and child health care in your state, and includes the application process. It includes what, if any, immigrant restrictions apply to any of these things, and it includes a detailed description of what your VOCA-funded post-assault health care covers in each state. So Judge Gonzales, can you talk about how this impacts judges who have children in cases before them who are in and out of care, in care or not in care for the state?
Well, the state has an obligation to provide medical services and other services to a child in care. And this is a drain on our resources locally as well. The opportunity to make sure that these kids are able to get and access these benefits goes a long way to assisting our counties in meeting that, for all intents and purposes, that budgetary obligation. But sometimes when the child then goes out of care and they are, for instance, on medications, they have ongoing medical issues, and they're no longer in care, Leslie, then it becomes difficult to provide them with the medical services that they need. And sometimes these are life-needing medical services. If we haven't basically gotten them this kind of benefits before they exit care.
Right, which is why I think the story about the judge you were talking about earlier is so important. Because if you can get a child pursuing immigration relief, then, in fact, I think I have a slide going almost in exactly that direction. You can see that they're on a trajectory so if they file a trafficking victim visa, then within 1 or 2 years, and maybe even faster if they can get continued presence, then they're eligible for all health care through Medicaid, as just like any other person would be through Medicaid. So it really, and they have access to all subsidized health care if they go through, yes.
So my friend Doug Johnson then was really thinking outside the box, because it isn't just about the immediate need of the child that he has in front of him, but the long-term trajectory of that child's life.
Exactly. Because what you're doing when you're helping a child file for a form of immigration relief that they're eligible for because they're victim of their victimization through sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child abuse, sexual assault, any of those things, they are on this path. And as you can see, they become lawfully present from a public benefits perspective or healthcare perspective, which gives them access to subsidized healthcare. And if most states, you see 32 states offer subsidized state-funded healthcare for child victims and for victims who have at these points in time. So it varies by immigration status how fast they get it. And then what happens is the state funding part, to get to your point, Judge Gonzales, is the reason the state is picking it up is there's a 5-year bar under federal law. And 32 states, when it comes to children, have said, we're going to pick that up. And then at the end of the 5 years, then the federal government pays for them. So you're starting a process, and the longer you wait and get that process started, the farther along in the child's life it is before they can get the help they need.
And
So,
I think that's why Judge Johnson was very keen on getting it started early, because he didn't want the children aging out of care without having this trajectory in place.
Exactly. So this is how immigration status for trafficked children essentially leads to benefits access, healthcare in particular, but qualified immigrant status is for everything else. And we'll go into that in more detail as we go through this. So let me give you a little bit more background about some of the other services that are available to immigrants without regard to immigration status. So I tend to be an encyclopedia of this, and sometimes I get a little bit too professorial, but I think it's important to understand context. So in 1996, there was a welfare reform bill that passed that reformed, among other things, immigrant access to public benefits. And later that year, there was a bill that was immigration reform that passed. And by the time in between the two, people were already seeing a dramatic drop and harm to particularly children that was occurring, and crime victims, because of lack of access to certain kinds of things and lack of clarity about what were public benefits and what weren't. So Congress, in the immigration reform bill, said, we're going to delegate to the Attorney General of the United States the ability we're going to say that programs necessary to protect life and safety are not federal public benefits, do not have restrictions, and we're going to delegate to the Attorney General of the United States the ability to describe or define what those programs are. And so what Janet Reno did is she said that in-kind services provided at the community level not based on an individual's income or resources, that are necessary to protect couple life and safety, are open to everyone without regard to immigration status. And so what that means, and that is why or where this comes from, that's why crisis counseling intervention programs, child and adult protective services, violence and abuse prevention programs, victim assistance programs, emergency treatment for mental health and substance abuse, help during disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, soup kitchens, community food banks, shelter and transitional housing for children and crime victims, and for the homeless are available, and nutrition programs that, the school lunch programs, the senior assistance programs, all of those come because, think about it, is your local shelter going to turn away the richest man's wife in the community who's abused? No, there's no income requirements for shelter. And so that's an example. This is a wide range of programs that when it comes to immigrant sex trafficking victims and their families, people don't often think about, but need to know that all of these are open to everybody, including any child trafficking victim that might be in one of your courts. And then the other part that I alluded to earlier is that when children qualify and their parents or caregivers do not, if the child qualifies, the child can apply, and the 2-year-old doesn't walk in even the 14-year-old doesn't walk into the benefits agency and apply themselves. And that's one of the things why we created some of the tools we created for you, because the other thing is, Judge, you can't order, non-English speaking auntie who's caregiving for the sex trafficked child, to go to the benefits agency in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and apply by herself.
No.
Because for a million reasons, language access is part of it. But the other part of it is many times the benefits workers don't know what immigrants are eligible for, or that an immigrant caregiver or parent can apply for a citizen child. So they'll turn people away and they won't get the benefits they're supposed to get.
Yeah, but there's also the problem that those who don't want to talk about their own status, right?
Right.
So, Judge, if I go ask for my son, then I'm going to be deported. What good is that going to do to my son then?
So the answer to that is that there is a policy that has been in place. It's part of the federal law that's been in place since, for decades, like since the 1990s at least. I think around the 1990s, late 1990s, that basically says that it instructs the benefits workers that what it bars them from asking about the immigration status or social security number of a person who's bringing a child in to apply for benefits, who's not additionally also applying for benefits for themselves. And that law was put into place, the regulation or policy was put into place because they knew they were seeing a drop, and they wanted to take away the fear that going to seek a benefit would trigger the deportation of the caregiver or the parent. Now, and they had a legitimate concern about that because under law, benefits workers are one of the only government agency staff who is mandated to report to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, anybody they know to be unlawfully in the United States and seeking benefits. So you don't want to order somebody to go get benefits if they don't qualify.
Right.
Which is why, again, by the end, I'm going to give you, you're not going to need to know this by heart at the end of this webinar, but what you'll have is the tools to look it up. So you'll never be easily look it up when you need to, so that you'll never be in a situation of sending an immigrant to apply for something they're not qualified for. So they thought about that, and they are not allowed, which is why you want an advocate or a volunteer or a lawyer or a community agency to go with the victim. So when the benefits worker says, oh, lady, you could get benefits too, and they're trying to do something nice, you can stand there and say, she's not seeking benefits for herself. She's only seeking it for the child. And not have to deal with immigration status.
Well, the next slide is my next question for you, because you've given us what the law is, you've given us what the rule is, but how do we deal with the fear in our immigrant communities that that's going to happen?
Well, I think part of it is these trainings. What we've learned nationally is that when advocates and attorneys, courts, adult and child protective services agency staff, psychologists know how to look up what who's legally entitled to what, and they can go and defend people. They can go and make sure that the benefits agency does it right. And there's a benefit to that, because what we see in communities where advocates have the knowledge and go with people applying, you're educating the benefits staff about, and so they know more about what your immigrant population is eligible for and are less likely to make mistakes, or to just not know kind of what people qualify for. So I think it's the way to overcome the fear is information and letting them know you're not going to send them to do it themselves.
And when we talk about information, it is about providing the information to the immigrant community, right?
Correct.
So it isn't just about telling the English speakers about it. You have to actually give them information in their own language, and talk to the communities about the fact that the parents, undocumented parents, can come forward and access these services.
Lauren, I'm going to ask you, could you make a note? Because what I'd like to do is add to the materials I'm providing. We have multilingual resources in different reading levels, because immigrants could be college educated graduates in their home country, or they could have high school degrees and be able to read and write fluently in their home country, or they could have third grade level English. And we have a set of brochures in those 3 different levels that explain benefits and immigration relief, and that you can call the police for help if you're a victim, and all of those kinds of things, translated into multiple languages that we can make available to the attendees that might help in that education process.
And I think this is one of those judicial leadership times also for those of you who are attending, because it doesn't necessarily have to be you that provides this information, but you bringing the information to your other judicial or your other justice stakeholders, your police department, your sheriff, your human services folks, so that they have these resources that are able to provide it to parents. A lot of what we're talking about here is not something that you from the bench are going to do, but it's important for you as judicial leaders to make sure that your partners in this process have the information to provide these services, because after all, it may not be done. It may not get done if we don't do it sometimes.
So now what we're going to do is talk a little bit about, as children, so the other part of this, let me just say, as children and their parents apply for immigration relief, I'm going to show you how benefits access expands beyond what we've been talking about so far. So this is a great chart that's been developed by the Department of Homeland Security as a screening tool, and it's in your materials that we're going to provide you, and it's alive. These are all links. If you click on, I don't know if you can see my weird cursor, but if you click on the U visa, not on the screen, it will take you to the Department of Homeland Security's website on U visas. If you click on the little circle, it'll take you to the forms. And that's true of all of these forms of relief. So what happens is the major forms of immigration relief, and we did a whole other webinar in this series that we welcome you to attend or to see online if you didn't attend it live, where we talk about the forms of immigration relief available to help child trafficking victims. The major forms are the VAWA self-petition, and that's ones where the trafficker or the abuser is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident parent of the child or step parent of the child. There's something called special immigrant juvenile status, and that's when the abuser or the person who abused, abandoned, or neglected the child is a parent of the child, one of the parents, and the abuse in those cases could have happened anywhere in the world. There are two forms of immigration relief that were created for child and adult trafficking victims. That's the T visa and continued presence. And continued presence is something that someone can get early in the process, but you have to find and link to a federal official who will file the case on behalf of the child you're working with. And finally, there's the U visa, which is more generally available to crime victims. And you may encounter children who come in and the first thing you think they're eligible for, the lawyer thinks they're eligible for, is a U visa, because they think you're dealing with a child victim of sexual assault. And then you figure out that actually this is a child victim of trafficking, of sex trafficking. And oftentimes the sex trafficking cases are discovered through the family violence cases or the sexual assault cases, and it's only later on in the case that they discover that they're a trafficking victim. And so the other thing that's important in this particular context is that in all of these cases, either you can have the applicant, the immigrant applying could be either the child who's an immigrant, who's the sex trafficking victim, or it could be, or it could be the child's non-abusive parent. So you can have the child, like a parent whose US citizen child is trafficked, who's an immigrant, can apply for a T visa. So it covers both the caregiver parent and the child. And we designed it that way because we wanted to encourage parents who were protective parents to be able to come forward and not be afraid. So when we talk about access to public benefits, what happens is there are groups. There are people who are qualified immigrants from benefits perspective and a healthcare perspective, and there are people who are not qualified immigrants. And if you're not a qualified immigrant, those people don't have access to healthcare or public benefits beyond what I just talked about, all the things open to everybody who's undocumented. But people who are lawful permanent residents or become lawful permanent residents because they filed a T visa or a special immigrant juvenile status or a U visa case, people who are asylee or refugees, people who are VAWA self-petitioners, and those are your family violence cases where the abuser is the US citizen or lawful permanent resident parent or step parent. Or it could be you could have, yes, in VAWA self-petitioning cases, you could have married child sex trafficking victims, right? Who are under the age of 21, so they're still children, and they could have been abused. They might be abused by their spouse, or they could have been trafficked by their parent, which is how they end up getting married at a young age. I mean, so it can happen in various ways. And then human trafficking victims and refugees and asylees have the most access to benefits of all of these groups, and lawful permanent residents. And so what happens is that every qualified immigrant, so anybody who's a VAWA self-petitioner, a trafficking victim, applying for a trafficking visa or T visa, a trafficking victim applying for an immigration case, or a lawful permanent resident, all of them have access as qualified immigrants to some public benefits, but which benefits they get, to make it more complicated, depends on their immigration status, when they entered the United States, what state they live in, and which program they're applying for. And I'll just tell you right off, the four hardest to receive, depending on your state, are TANF, subsidized healthcare, subsidized childcare through the TANF program, SSI, and food stamps. Now, children, to when states or the federal government provide access, they're more likely to provide them to children than to adults, and we'll go over that.
Before we move on to the poll question, Leslie, I just want to wrap my head around this
Sure.
whole issue, because the purpose here, the federal government isn't just being magnanimous with this, right? There's a purpose for why these things came in place, and you were at the table when these things were talked about. Was law enforcement a big push to get a lot of this legislation passed?
There were some law enforcement officials involved, yes, but the push actually came from, bipartisan members of Congress who wanted to fight crime and understood, because they'd been former prosecutors, for example, that, if they could stabilize their witnesses,
Right.
they'd have better prosecutions. And so they understood that when you're giving immigration status to victims, giving them benefits access as well makes it more, it gives the trafficker less leverage over them, fewer levers they can pull to control and coerce the victim. And that also more freedom and independence and ability to heal.
And I think that's important for our audience to really wrap their heads around, because this is not about, being liberal or being nicey or any of that. This is really about basically safe communities.
Mm-hmm. And safe communities, you were talking earlier about the trajectory of somebody's life. You help a child now, you're changing the trajectory of their life, which means less criminal involvement, better mental health, all kinds of things that will make your community safer and healthier and better, and people more able to contribute to society, and less people who need support and assistance to do so, I guess you could say.
Right. So this is one of those situations where to spend a few dollars now is very wise to save a lot of dollars later.
Exactly. Okay. And we know that immigrants in particular, really these immigrant crime victims, partially because they're getting support from the courts, from law enforcement, from victim advocates and attorneys and psychologists, that once they begin to gain legal immigration status and access to these benefits programs and work authorization, they thrive. And that they actually are working and their salaries go up and they get jobs that pay health care, and all kinds of things start changing, so that the time that they're dependent on, or that they need to depend on these public benefits and supports, is not forever. It's a real transition to a new life for them, is the way I think about it, and a key part of that.
So keeping in mind that that's what we're doing, let's go back and see where the audience sits on this question. What do you think? So let's go to the poll. Which of the following is not eligible for public and or assisted housing? Lawful permanent resident SIJS children, bona fide T visa applicants, U visa holders, VAWA self-petitioners, or asylum recipients or refugees? Let's see how many folks.
And you can guess, it's okay.
Yeah, guessing is okay. Leslie has given us some hints, but guessing is good.
Okay, a few more of you want to try? We got about 30%.
You're being shy, Leslie.
Yeah.
You're bound to have some luck if you're just guessing, because the statistics are with you.
Okay. I think we should end the poll, because I also am conscious of the time and want to make sure we're getting through everything.
All right. Well, we had nobody said lawful permanent resident, SIJS children. And we had the majority, well, because you dropped the hint about asylums and refugees getting the most.
Right, but this is not eligible. So the only group of these people who is not eligible are the U visa holders.
Yep.
Everybody else gets public and assisted housing on this list. So 25% of you got it right, but that's fine.
Yep, don't be mad at us. It wasn't a trick question, but it is. So why do you
Yeah.
think you visa people don't have it, Leslie?
Because the U visa was created after benefits access was given to the VAWA self-petitioners as a matter of federal law. And that after that law passed, there hasn't been a major benefits reform for immigrants since then
That's right.
that they could be involved in. That's kind of that's where we are.
I think there was, so I wanted to get that across because a lot of this happened before the last go around with when this particular issue became so divisive in Congress.
Exactly. Right. The benefits.
United, and we were united and bipartisan, but that is happening now.
Right. So, but that in 1996 were the benefits reforms that gave VAWAs access to benefits. And then in 2000, we created the U visa and the T visa. And the T visas were given benefits and the U visas weren't. And that's just where things are now. So as to public and assisted housing, so what every qualified immigrant gets, every lawful permanent resident, whether they got their lawful permanent residency through the U visa or SIJ, every asylee, refugee, VAWA self-petitioner get public and assisted housing, post-secondary educational grants and loans. Driver's licenses, believe it or not, are a federal public benefit. They're a state public benefit. That's how they're considered. So it's at work authorization is the point where people get driver's licenses. So some people can get it before, if they get work authorization as part of their immigration case earlier than they get their immigration case approved. Many do. So it's a lot of undocumented people and the crime victims in the process of applying for immigration relief get driver's licenses earlier than when they get work authorization. Most TANF-funded TANF-funded healthcare is available to qualified immigrants, as is there's another form of other forms of childcare are also available. Adoption assistance and foster care. I want to mention those two because let's go back to Aunt Sarah, let's say, who's caring for the sex trafficked child you're working with. If Aunt Sarah ends up, let's say she's a survivor of domestic violence and has a VAWA self-petition approved, or she files a VAWA self-petition, she becomes eligible for benefits, which allows her to be eligible for adoption assistance payments and foster care payments. So caregivers, whether they get adoption or foster care payments depends on their own immigration status, not the immigration status of the child. So that's something you want to be a kind of tweak you want to be aware of here. I just did that.
I was going to ask you that question.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. What role, Judge Gonzales, can judges play in promoting access to higher education for child trafficking victims?
And again, this goes back to the trajectory we were talking about, because there are benefits available, but you have to make sure that the child qualifies. And so going right back to whether or not you should order folks to apply for benefits, getting the status established early can lead to a trajectory that takes us to higher education, as opposed to prohibiting kids from getting in higher education.
Exactly. And there's 22 states that provide in-state tuition to children who are not citizens or lawful permanent residents. 17 states will do financial aid with that regard to immigration status. And 4 states ban enrollment. 3 states ban enrollment for undocumented students. But FAFSA, federally funded benefits are available, hold on, I think that's the next one, is available to VAWA self-petitioners and their children 3 months after filing. Children who get lawful permanent residency through SIJS, trafficking victims, refugees, asylees, etc. So there's, and this is fairly quick. I mean, the U visas have to wait the longest, but SIJS, it's within 3 years. So if a child is at 10 or 12 or 14 when they come to you, by the time they're 17, they're eligible for college, federally funded college education. So that's kind of the way to think about it.
And I think those states that prohibit kids from getting these benefits are being short-sighted, Leslie, in that they're not thinking the long picture, because these are future productive members of their community and can enter into their workforce in a productive way. So I think that the research is showing us, like as you say, that immigrant kids and families can be very productive, can provide much to the community and much to the economy, provided they are given the opportunity to do so.
And when you're talking about sex trafficked children, part of that is giving them something to hope for, to look forward to make of themselves, to give them a different path. And post-secondary education can play a super amazingly great role in that, in giving them a path to an income that, will keep, they can see a future that they don't have to, that they'll be less enticed to go back to their traffickers.
Exactly.
So what happens now, we're going to talk about, so what happens is these programs, I mentioned them earlier, TANF, SSI, food stamps, Medicaid, and the Child Health Insurance Program. And with TANF comes TANF-funded childcare, are the most restricted immigration benefits. This is a chart for you. I'm not going to go into the details. This is a chart for you to use. But I just wanted you to kind of see in a snapshot what, and most of them have 5-year bars at least. And some of them have higher restrictions. SSI is very, very difficult for immigrants. There are some people that are exempt from the 5-year bar, and it includes victims of severe forms of human trafficking. So if you're working with a child trafficking victim and they get their immigration relief through the T visa, as opposed to, they can apply for SIJS and the T visa and VAWA, they can apply for all of them. But if they're able to get their immigration status through the T visa, then they're exempt from the 5-year bar and they're immediately eligible for federally funded healthcare, TANF, all of that. And the states that offer it don't have to pay it because the feds will pay it. So it's important to understand that. And that's why you want people applying for trafficking victim cases, why you want judges to do T visa declarations and encourage people to explore the trafficking if the judge or the court or the people involved with the court system are the first ones to identify this child as having been trafficked, in addition to being a victim of sexual assault or child abuse or whatever else it might be. So states under federal law have the option, this is back in that 1996 law, and they have the option to either grant more access to public benefits than the federal baseline or less. And so most states have given, especially when it comes to children, immigrant children, have given more. And so I'm going to show you, let's see how my technology is doing. So we have a public benefits map, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how to use it. So this is what I've been promising you. There'll be a way to see. So now Malika, you're there to help me if I mess it up, but I think I go like this. Let's see here. Go like this. Yeah, and I go here. Good. So Judge Gonzales, do you see my screen? Do you see the benefits map?
Go to the map. Yep.
Okay. What would you like me to look up for in Wisconsin?
Let's go to emergency Medicaid.
No, that one everybody gets. So we want to go to one of the harder ones.
Let's see.
Child health care or TANF?
Child care.
Okay. So you go here and then you see the map, and when you hit, where's Wisconsin? Wisconsin. You go to the bottom and it tells you what a self-petitioner gets, what a refugee gets, what an asylee gets, etc. And I want to show you actually a different one for a second. Let's see if I can do this, or if it'll let me
go to TANF?
Yeah, I'm going to go to TANF.
Go to TANF.
And we'll go to TANF, we'll go to Wisconsin.
Because now this will be different.
Yeah, this is a little bit easier. So if you look here and you look at continued presence or trafficking victims. It's just eligible. So we created this so you can see who's not eligible. And if they're not eligible, you don't have to go any farther. If they're eligible, or if they're eligible with conditions, the way that tells you, oh, you're looking at somebody who's likely to be eligible in some way, and then you want to look at the details. So you go to the bottom and you hit this chart, and there's one for every state. It brings you to the state benefits chart for your state. And you can look up and see the details of so Wisconsin, for example, TANF, for a VAWA self-petitioner or a trafficking victim, it's here the same way. Eligibility, sorry. A little hard with the screen and whatever. But basically, during the first 5 years, Wisconsin Works pays for TANF for the child trafficking victim, okay? And for a victim of domestic violence I think it's a parent. So, and then what happens is, I don't know if I can do this part, but it's kind of fancy. Let's see if I can make it work. I haven't been able to make it work on the screen. Anyway, in addition, so that you can go advocate in your state, for those of the judges who want to know where did this come from, we have all the citations for everything. And you can look it up and take it in and advocate. We're creating new screening charts that are a simpler version of this, but this is available for you to use on any case you have, and it gives you all the information and where the law came from, so that you can see what people qualify for all of these different benefits programs.
So then when somebody pushes back on you, that they say, well, no, I don't qualify that, or that's not what Wisconsin does, or that's not what Nebraska does, you can actually have the legal basis by which to push back.
Exactly.
To make your orders.
And have the legally correct information. Pardon, what did you say?
And to make your orders, because you don't want to order things that you can't order, that
Exactly.
they can't comply with. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know where I am in my trajectory here. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah. There's the demonstration. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly right. So you're not going to be in a position of ordering somebody to get something they're not eligible for. That's why we created these. So let's go into a little more detail on a couple of different benefits that are really important to child sex trafficking survivors and child labor trafficking survivors and their parents and their families. In terms of healthcare, as I said earlier, only lawfully present immigrants, which include, let me see if I have it. Yeah, I have it on the next slide. Only lawfully present immigrants are able to access healthcare. And that means they get state funding for the 5 years while they're during the 5-year bar. And this summarizes how many states do what. So as you can see, that when you're talking to state funded benefits for immigrants in the healthcare arena, lawfully present children, there's 31 states that provide healthcare. So that's a lot of states. Many, many of the states you'll be in will not have a 5-year bar for child access to healthcare. If you're in a state with a 5-year bar, then you go to the public health clinics. Yeah. So there's the answer is never from healthcare perspective, there's no place to go. It's just where you go depends on your state law and the immigration status that child or their caregiver is pursuing. And the next greatest amount of people are covered are pregnant women. So in many states, children, both children and adults who are pregnant, will get access to healthcare when other immigrants don't. That's the next biggest one. So where might you direct caregivers of trafficked children to get food assistance?
So should we ask our 21 participants and see what we get?
Sounds good. Anybody have an idea?
Anybody have an idea? I'm putting it in the chat.
Get to take a sip of water in the meantime.
Yep, we do that.
I mean, think creatively. Think about what we were talking about earlier about programs open to everyone that without regard to immigration status. Who offers food assistance in your communities?
So it could be my Salvation Army,
Yep,
my county health people, anybody
yep,
who's going to give me the pantries,
yep,
anybody who's going to be out there giving out free food, right, Leslie?
exactly. So all of those kind of food bank, food kitchen programs are open to everyone without regard to immigration status. But then, in addition, let's look at who gets federal food stamps. So qualified immigrant children under 18, no matter when when they entered the country, are eligible for food stamps. So if a mother is abused or the child is abused by their citizen, the mother's abused by her citizen or lawful permanent resident husband and has children, and the sex trafficked child might be that child, or you have a child who's abused by their citizen or lawful permanent resident parent. So it's a VAWA self-petitioner. The moment, 3 months after filing the VAWA self-petition, they will be out. The children will all be eligible for food stamps based on the self-petition when they get what's called a prima facie determination. T visa victims who get continued presence or a bona fide determination in the T visa case are eligible for federal food stamps if they're under 18. So these children that you're working with are under 18. SIJS children who file their SIJS case and get lawful permanent residency the moment they're a lawful permanent resident and under 18. Same thing with U visas, but that's a longer wait.
Yep.
They get food stamps. Qualified immigrants. So, if you have a child, let's say the child comes into your care as a judge when they're 8, and maybe they're labor trafficked, maybe they're sex trafficked, maybe they're abused, but they file their immigration case. By the time they're 13, the 5-year bar will have passed and they'll be eligible for food stamps. Trafficking victims, when they get either an HHS certification or eligibility letter because of a bona fide T visa case or continued presence or the actual T visa, are eligible for food stamps. And there's some qualified immigrants that might qualify for SSI or disability benefits, very small group. That group would also be eligible for food stamps. So it's quite a, but this shows you how, from a very real perspective, starting the immigration cases early drives access to other benefits for the food security, for example, for these kids.
Mm-hmm.
A few states have also provided state-funded food stamps for different groups of children, and the only one that all get it, only trafficking victims, T visa applicants, get it in all states.
Yeah.
So if you go one of the other routes, you have to, that there's a smaller number of states that offer. So,
Wow. Driver's
so
license, right? Right.
Exactly.
Driver's license. The other key to change the trajectory. One is education, and the other one is the ability to drive in this country.
Right. And why is that important? I mean, how are the different ways driver's license might affect the cases that you see before you, Judge Gonzales?
Well, whether a child works or not, whether a child has identification, whether a child it has the opportunity to, in many of our communities, rural communities, be able to get from one place to the other. It is the golden ticket in many of our communities for a better life, for better paying jobs, and for better access to education.
Exactly. So what happens is, and this is a slightly different thing, which is why it has its own slide, that you should know about, is work authorization or driver's license are a little bit different than other federal public benefits because they essentially, in most states, almost everywhere, they follow work authorization. So a VAWA self-petitioner whose abuser is, and this is why the immigration attorney of referral that the judge did is so important, because the immigration lawyers or the legal services lawyers have to help the victim figure this out. They don't just pick the immigration status based on which is the fastest. They have to pick on what comes with it for them and how long it takes. And so what happens is a VAWA self-petitioner whose abuser is a U.S. citizen parent, so the sex trafficked child is abuser is a U.S. citizen parent, they get work authorization. And believe it or not, the 8-year-old gets a work authorization card. Mm-hmm. The way DHS, Department of Homeland Security, gives them access to an ID or passport, like an ID, not passport, because these are not there yet. So they get a work authorization card. One of my family members called up one time. She's an immigrant, and she calls up and she's like, my 8-year-old just got work authorization. Why would they do that? Well, the reason they're doing it is state IDs and work authorization for, a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old kid. And so, and there'll be lots of people. So U visa victims. So if you have a child who's pursuing a U visa because they don't qualify for a trafficking victim visa, maybe, somewhere between 2 and 5 years, they'll get work authorization. They will be totally undocumented, but they will have work authorization. And that work authorization gives them access to a driver's license. And in some states, that work authorization or deferred action may give them access to healthcare. So it depends, it varies, but that's how. And so for SIJS children, it will take no more than 3 years. Some of these cases move as fast as 6 months. But they have to get lawful permanent residency that's the point at which SIJS children get work authorization. State driver's license and IDs are only issued in 13 states. 3 states give it at deferred action, which is a little bit earlier than work authorization for some victims. And the only one that gives it to VAWA self-petitioners upon filing the VAWA self-petitioner is Maine. Okay. And I think we did this, right?
Yep, we did.
Okay. So TANF and TANF funded childcare, they kind of go together. So TANF and TANF funded childcare, the most access, again, here's where pursuing the trafficking case, the T visa or continued presence is the fastest way. Continued presence is the fastest way to get a sex trafficked child access to TANF in your state. If they they'll get an HHS certification letter or eligibility letter, and they will get access to TANF. Other than that, then you have to pursue that there are qualified immigrants are eligible in 15 states. So qualified immigrants are U visas with deferred. No, sorry, that's wrong. Qualified immigrants are see, I even get mixed up sometimes, which is why we made the maps. Qualified immigrants are VAWA self-petitioners at 3 months after filing, T visas, and SIJS children after they get lawful permanent residency. But as you can see here, for TANF, 7 states give SIJS applicant children TANF. 4 states give U visa applicant children TANF, and 3 states give waitlist approved, and that's now bona fide people TANF.
Yes. So Leslie, taking note of the time we have left.
Yes.
So they're not going to remember. We're not going to remember all of these details. But what, as a judge, should I take away from all of this?
So I think the thing to take away is that there's much more available, although as we get into, the different statuses, it gets a little bit more complicated. That's why we made the charts. That basically, I think the biggest takeaway is that don't presume people aren't eligible. Right. Understand all of those benefits and services I talked about before, healthcare from the public health center systems, food pantries, shelters, transitional housing, therapy that can come from, that can be emergency or that could come through victim services or VOCA funded. Those kinds of things are available for everyone. And you can start with everyone. And then for each of the cases, you can appoint counsel or assign a victim advocate to work with them to figure out, if they're an immigrant, what they might be eligible for, and in your state, how that's going to affect access to public benefits. And then potentially to come back to you as a judge. So, I could come back to you, Judge Gonzales, if I'm before you and you've asked me to look into this case. I might come back to you and say, okay, Your Honor, would you give me a T visa declaration?
Right.
Or would you give me findings? I need findings in an SIJS case, because a child that needs health care, let's say I've got a kid who, because of the STD she contracted with, the sex trafficking, really needs healthcare right now. And she can go to the public health clinic, but there's a specialist in my community that can treat her if she has Medicaid.
Right.
So I know in my state that that if she files an SIJS application and a T visa application, she will immediately, as an SIJS applicant, get healthcare.
Right.
And then I can pursue the T visa case, which is probably going to be decided sooner anyway, but I get her healthcare through the SIJS case in the meantime.
Yeah.
So there's things you can do to navigate. And so the biggest thing I think is be able to know how to look up who before you qualifies for what and refer people so that you get that child or their caregiver to someone in your community that can help them figure this out, navigate this.
And I think I just want to show the next few slides so folks have a sense of what we're talking about, because it's about child care funding, which is crucial for folks that have to work. And we want to make sure that people safely care for their children.
Mm-hmm.
And also application for SSI and what the various downsides and upsides of this. Is there anything in particular? I mean, people really just need to get a sense that this is a possibility.
Right.
But you got to really look, especially on that map, to make sure that you are able to steer folks in the right way. And the one that really surprised me, Leslie, is this heating and cooling crisis assistance business.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so basically what's interesting here is many of these sex trafficked children are going to be living in mixed immigration status families. Mm-hmm. But for the LAHEAP and the WAP, it's called, the different heating and cooling programs, all you need is one family member. So it might be that the sex trafficking victim is a citizen. It might be that the sex trafficking victim has a younger brother who's like 2, who's a citizen. And that person is enough for the family to qualify. And so, but in addition, sex trafficked children who apply for a T visa, get continued presence, can get weatherization assistance for their family, for the family and the caregiver for the household that they're living in. And that's kind of how that works.
And the disaster relief. So they only need one person for that disaster relief, which is the next slide.
Exactly. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So there are things that can make the difference between whether a family survives or doesn't survive, a child survives or doesn't survive, based upon somebody knowing what benefits they may qualify for. And
exactly.
And to me, that's why it's so important for judges to have not to be experts in this, but to have a working understanding of the impact that these kinds of programs can have on the kids that come into our courts that are part of the call of our jurisdiction to take care of the kids in our community.
Exactly. And so we. In closing, I want to talk a little bit more about our materials. We're going to distribute to you a webpage that has all of the training materials on it. It has things that cover from both of the webinars, both the immigration relief webinar and this benefits webinar. And it gives you links to not only the public benefits charts I showed you, but it also has a toolkit on special immigrant juvenile status It has a judicial certification guide for T visa, trafficking victim visas, and U visa cases. It has, you know, some materials on special issues that might come up if you happen to be sitting in a family court case with, you know, a child trafficking victim or a child victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse. So the idea, and then we have a web library that has more materials, and we're available, as I said, for technical assistance to you. But we also, I wanted to give Judge Gonzales a few minutes to talk as well about, for those of you that are judicial officers and or who are working in courts with judicial officers, tell you a little bit about our National Judicial Network.
Yeah, and I want to encourage you that our judges, our judicial officers, to join us. So basically, we have a national judicial network, which are like-minded judges who understand that these immigration issues impact all of the cases, in fact, that we deal with, and that we need to be advised and informed of the kinds of things that we need to look out for, and that we're able to be the leaders in our community to assist other stakeholders to provide the services that are necessary to make our communities safer, and to provide the services that our children who are charges need. And there is the Survey Monkey to register. We encourage you to join us. We have meetings. It doesn't take a lot. You can spend as much or as little time with us, and we let you know in the beginning what's going to be covered in the meetings, and we welcome and ask you all to consider joining us.
And I think what another point for this webinar in particular about the National Judicial Network is a number of judges who founded child sex trafficking courts are active members of this National Judicial Network and are sharing information with each other. The judicial networks, we have 2 webinars coming up. One is on custody, issues around immigrant crime victims, immigrant victims of trafficking and sexual assault and domestic violence and child abuse, and custody next Monday. And then on, I believe it's January 11th, we're doing one on adult victims of labor trafficking, or adult victims of trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. So if you have an interest in that.
Yeah, not to mention we can reach out to each other one-on-one. It is a community. It is a community of judges, and I encourage you to join us.
Wonderful. And the last point I want to make is we will have with the materials at this link. We will send you an email with all the materials, and I'll add the multilingual materials that I promised to the list. And this is how you can reach us for technical assistance if you have a case and you have questions. And we're here to help and support you in working with the people that come before you in your courts, and working to help child sex trafficking, child labor trafficking, and immigrant crime victims that you may encounter in your work. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Judge Gonzales, for joining me as faculty.
We came to the end of our 90 minutes together, and thank you very much for spending your time with us. Have a great rest of your evening.